Conversation around Megagaming, and it's going to get more informal as we go, so if any thoughts come to mind, feel free to jump in, because I'm quite mindful that we might not get to a formal Q&A session. So if a really burning question pops up, well, just pop up yourself and join in. So so this session is about Melbourne as a mega game, and what a massively multi-playable city might be like. 2019, going back to then, we had our first Urban Play Symposium, where we started this conversation about place. And Felix was helping me out with promotions and organising Playable City, and said, I've been playing Megagames. I said, wow, that sounds amazing. So, and it's stuck with me ever since. And of course, pandemic, blah, blah, blah. So here we are back to resume that conversation and get into experiencing and being in Megagames. And I think that this is, for me, a concept that is really, really connected with everything that we've been talking about in terms of community, but also the imaginative possibilities of play as a state of possibility, and also play as a form of, critiquing and deconstructing the systems that we live in. So we're going to be picking up on some of the conversations from the previous session. But I have this wonderful panel here with me who have volunteered their time to have this conversation around Melbourne as a mega game. And so you all know who I am, so I'm now going to ask the panel. I think I said 5 minutes, but maybe if you can go 2 minutes, just quickly introduce you and what you do, a bit about your studio or projects that you're engaged with, where you're from. We'll start with Nellie.
Hello, so my name is Nellie. I am the co-founder and co-director of Melbourne Megagames. So my business partner Tristan is not here, but in 2019 we set up Melbourne Megagames after having watched the eternal shut up and sit down video of Watch the Skies, which really catapulted Megagames kind of into the global consciousness from their history as war games. So we've been running Megagames in Melbourne since then, slightly shafted by the lockdowns, as getting 30 to 100 people into a room at the same time gets really challenging when you have an airborne virus. We'll talk a little bit more about that, I guess, further on. But I'm also a PhD student. I'm a games researcher, and my work looks at how games and museums and cultural spaces kind of interlink. I'll leave it there if we're going for time.
Yeah, perfect, thank you. And move on to Hailey.
Hi, Hailey, Cooperrider. I think how I kind of ended up on this stage started with a real curiosity about large-scale collaboration. So when Wikipedia and open source software were happening in the early to mid 2000s, I said, that's awesome. When are we going to use that to make policy and to co-create a world that works for everyone? And spent the next 5 years diving into learning why that was so hard, and then ended up becoming a workshop facilitator, collaboration designer, working a lot with the public sector, doing projects that were about engaging in large-scale collaboration or community engagement, digital stuff as well. And during that time, had this epiphany while playing Dungeons & Dragons that, oh my, this collaboration, this co-creation that's happening at this table is so superior to the things I try to drag people through in workshops. Surely there's something here in terms of scaling collaboration capability. And that led me into co-founding Amble Studio, which we've been working on for a couple of years, which is about really exploring that borderland between ways of working in collaboration and games. And that's led us a lot into story games, and also a project I hope maybe I can talk about more around local adaptation to climate change through a kind of a mega game, maybe, but what's a mega game?
G'day. My name is Sidney Bowden. I am here under Waxwings Games, which is a studio I started in my early 30s about really bringing in participatory co-design into games. My games experience, my simulation experience, I was running Mega Games for 7 years. Of course, I was doing it with the Royal Australian Air Force. We didn't call it Mega Games. We called it a multi-domain application of kinetic force exercise. After that, I went into healthcare, and I worked in a simulation space in healthcare, and now I continue to work in systems change through healthcare. And what I found is that we have so many specialists out there working in fields. We have so many people that are such experts in the things that they do, and we don't have avenues for them to engage. We don't have problems in front of them for them to solve at a really tactile and engaging level. And so Waxwings Games endeavours to give people an opportunity to express their specialisations and express their passion for the work that they do. And I am joining in on this project for local adaptation for climate change, and I really look forward to talking about that because we just had a really successful workshop that I just can't wait to talk more about.
So my name is Ceri. I'm one half of Public Assembly with Linda Roberts, but also work across the year at RMIT, notoriously finished my PhD in 2016, submitting it with like 1,000 Wikipedia hyperlinks as the only references. But that's okay because the title was The Making of a Knowledge Casino, so it's all about destabilized knowledge systems ultimately. But very interested in this, as you following on, it relates to a lot of things that were mentioned in the last part of the panel discussions.
Thank you. You can call me Lee, and basically my background is a bit of a eclectic one. Got into creativity through writing. I've done a lot of work in the last several years with tabletop role-playing games. Started off as a kid playing D&D because everyone starts off playing D&D. But now I run game jams and conventions for independent developers from Australia and Southeast Asia. And I am currently a PhD candidate at RMIT, and the more I develop my project, the more that I look at different ways of bringing in ways of expressing ideas, ways of communicating knowledge, ways of thinking about knowledge and storing it and bringing it from place to place, from group to group, sharing it and all of that sort of thing. And I think I'm just basically here because I'm very interested in interactivity and that kind of community aspect to these sorts of games.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really fantastic introduction, and can see the kind of interdisciplinary collaboration that happens in this type of space. I'm going to put this avatar here to represent Ben from City Libraries at City of Melbourne, who can't be here today but has been enthusiastically talking with me about Melbourne Megagames, or Melbourne as a mega game in connection with libraries over the past year. And we've even, to the extent of setting up a Discord for having this conversation. But again, as due to the pandemic, et cetera, we're kind of just coming back to that conversation now. But Ben really wanted to be here, but is on a plane or something, so yeah, a bit hard. So I'm going to start off with asking you, Nellie, what is a mega game? Maybe not everyone here knows what these things are, and also what is the experience of the player? Why would you play a mega game? Not only what it is, but what's it like to play?
So the obvious answer is it's just a really big game. More complexly than that, I would describe it as like a large-scale role-playing game. So role-playing is really central, particularly for the community that we have of mega gamers in Melbourne. It's the number one thing that they care about in our games. But they also combine elements of strategy and factional politics. Often mega games are set up in team arrangements, but there are different ways you can kind of do your agent structure, I guess, within a game. And they often combine elements of board game mechanics. They are evolving. So through the pandemic, I know that some of the groups in the UK tried to do online games, mega games, and you can do kind of, over the course of a week, a kind of play-by-email game, or they did using things like Gather, to run a mega game as you would in a physical space. So often our games are set up in a room roughly of like this size. We'll have people gathered around teams, and then they go. The other aspect of the mega is that they usually go for 6 to 8 hours. So it's a whole day event. You'll get your kind of team briefing and character allocation and the rules ahead of time. You show up, you play the game, and then often we go to the pub afterwards and have a debrief and a chat. And the experience of being a player is usually hectic, and to me it's always a huge amount of fun. People come with their friends, it's a really community-oriented experience, and it's about kind of having those playful interactions and playing often, like a board game or a role-playing game, just at a huge scale.
Yeah, great. And watching this video, Watch the Skies, and this is to your point earlier, Hailey, about emergent gameplay. I noticed one of the players was even gaming their team because they were going, so this is in this game, the various factions are actually countries. I think they were playing Japan, and they were going to other countries to get resources to, deal with the fact that there are all these UFOs floating next to the Japan, and Tokyo was destroyed. And this is what I recall. But the thing I really remember, though, is this particular player revealed at the end that they'd been skimming off the top. They'd made their own game. They were just like taking some of they're saying, well, yeah, that information's going to cost $2 million, and they were keeping $1 million for themselves. So I'm really interested about that social aspect and how that might play into what you were talking about in terms of your own experience with, this being a kind of also an amazing workshopping or kind of group connective thought experiment, I guess.
Yeah, sure. I was thinking maybe what I could do to provide, in a sense, a grounding or another perspective to the mega games for fun. The new upcoming mega game, which I'm signed up for, I don't know if there's any spots left, is Crisis in Elysium. We'll be playing factional politics on a Mars colony. And so you can say that, well, that's for fun game, it's entertainment, it's about the experience, there's no stakes. And so then there's this discussion of serious games or applied games or games that have a purpose. And within that, there's a huge realm, and in fact, the next 3 days, there's the Games for Change conference for Asia Pacific region here in Melbourne. And there's probably still tickets if you want to get into that. And if you design a game, you can get serious outcomes you can still get serious outcomes from a game about Mars, because people are still getting immersed, they're taking on a role of decision-making or engaging with politics, they're engaging with complexity, and they're maybe actually learning something that they can apply to their real life. But then when Troy says, let's make a mega game about Melbourne, or of Melbourne, or in Melbourne, you start to go, well, okay, why, and what does that mean? And we start to blur the line. We don't have that kind of well-defined magic circle anymore, and we start to bleed into, well, Melbourne is here, and it has real politics and real people and real stakes. And so we start to have to ask maybe a whole additional set of questions about what are we trying to achieve. And I think that's why I love that kind of what design really intend question in earlier, because I think your responsibility only becomes higher, and you need to be more intentional about that, and yet you don't want to become so intentional that you're brainwashing people or doing something unethical or squeezing all the emergent play out of it. I'm not sure if I went where you were hoping to go, but I emerged.
No, that's good. Sidney, do you want to jump in on that?
For sure. I'm a huge believer that not only can you use a game about Mars to teach you things, but that you should be. It's called the Trojan horse of gaming, which is that you're seeking these really... Watch the Skies. Watch the Skies, as I mentioned before. It's a game about aliens invading Earth, but what it's really about is climate change. There's a universal problem that affects some countries more than others, and we all need to work together to fix it. It could have been a very prescient game about COVID. What it is sneaking these ideas in through palatable, enjoyable, engageable systems. There is a real problem in conducting military gaming, military exercises, that people stick to known procedures because it's A, what they think they're supposed to do, and it's B, what they know is a way to move forward. It's their default state. And the best way to shake up the default state is to really put them in a snow globe of different ideas and give it a good old rattle and see what falls down. And telling them, okay, you're no longer doing an intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance submarine hunt in the Pacific Ocean, you're now doing it on Neptune, on an entire planet that's a hydrosphere. Like, what's your next step? And there's really so much to draw out and so much to learn from that to say that we're good enough friends that we can have conflict on this stage. To say that there are serious games and there are playful games, I think is narrowing the scope and is narrowing it in a way that is not helpful.
Ceri.
Yeah, well, no, I'm very interested in this idea of like, well, even the war, its origins in war games and whether or not, how far back you go with what war is ultimately, father of all things. Some of the research that I, very preliminary, obviously, Wikipedia hyperlinks, it's very preliminary research, but the idea of the application of game theory to warfare, and then the development of chaoplexic. Have you heard of chaoplexic, and also network-centric warfare? Okay, so this idea that when you see those huge kind of telephone kind of field things back in the Korean War, basically where are we in the field? I'm not sure where we're in the field. You were going to wait until we get directives from HQ to actually tell us what to do, but to actually be able to as communication systems improved, to actually have individuals with individual combatants with very sophisticated communications technology to be deployed in the field. A little bit that field could be quite complex, but they have information on a need-to-know basis to do what they need to do within that. A bit like the way a big hive would operate, with all hive animals. Okay, so and the next point I'm going to make is that actually, is it possible? Is it possible that the camouflage for the military-industrial establishment has got so good that we don't realise that we're all actually military combatants at this point, and we've got a device in our pocket, and we're being told exactly what to do most of the time, nudged into that, Cass on Steam kind of nudging, and that in a way that, and this is even to game the game, is the possibility that those people that have already destroyed a lot of the planet's environment and made a lot of money out of it are not only going to kind of continue destroying it, but are going to kind of install a very totalitarian system that treats the whole planet like an expanded warfare zone, and have us as individuals kind of be played against each other, as if the environment was the threat, but it's actually possibly still kind of like a kind of insidiously kind of sociopathic class of warmongers that are actually playing us off like little kind of ants in a nest. But that's just maybe just my paranoid delusions as to the fact that they could actually sell us that by turning it into a big fun game. Okay, sorry, I'm probably time to hand the microphone over.
No, that's fine. Actually, I would actually really like to springboard off some of that, because I've had some great conversations, particularly with a friend of mine who's very, very into ARG development, and those kind of I Love Bees, the Jejune Institute type things. Talking about the spaces in between the game and real life, because a lot of those early ARGs were very much about blurring those lines, and they were very much about having that kind of subversive presence underneath the, underneath the reality, and making connections between reality and that subversive presence, which has sort of fallen out of the ARG community a little bit, because there are understandably some ethical issues of the idea of pretending that something is not a game when it is, and then involving reality and potentially passers-by, the general public who are not in on the joke, so to speak, and things like that. But one of the conversations that we have a lot is about these kinds of phones and these devices that we have with us that are methods of surveillance, but also can conversely be very counter-surveillance. They can be ways for us to organise Just because we have the Samsung phone with the Google software on it, we can also choose other third-party devices. We can choose to spoof locations on Google if that's relevant. If you ever look up protest guidelines and things like that, there are entire sections of that based on turning these phones into devices to subvert and misdirect the organisations that they're supposed to be informing. So I think bringing this back to Megagames then, after a very brief divergence for another concept, which is when you're bringing this kind of, that's all right, it's diversions all the way down. When you are building a game into a space, one of the things that this friend and I have discussed several times is how to create the delineation of the magic circle. Because as soon as you put a game into a space and tell people, be emergent, explore, someone's going to try and get into the janitor's closet. Someone's going to try and get into the staff room, which is not part of the game, but you as a game designer, without breaking the immersion, have very little way of delineating these spaces from each other, which is all a very long-winded way to say, I think, that when you're designing a mega game and when you're designing any of these, and obviously I keep coming back to ARGs because that's a lot of the thinking that I've done around the topic, is kind of coming back to this idea of how do you delineate space subtly? How do you delineate these processes? How do you design systems with an acknowledgement of what they can do, what they encourage, but also with an acknowledgement that people are totally capable of turning those systems on their head and creating something that is, of entering the staff room closet, so to speak, of spoofing the Google location with any of the systems that you bring to the table. And in some ways you do want to encourage that as a way of preventing this kind of totalitarianism, but also it's something to watch out for from a design perspective as well.
Yeah, in 2010, I created an ARG, alternate reality game called Urban Codemakers, which was about what could happen if game designers were to reimagine or recreate the city. And one of the fictions that launched this game was a demonstration that we staged from Guildford Lane to what was then the City Square, stayed kind of around this idea that the City of Melbourne had banned public play, and did the whole ARG construction of fiction, press release, and so forth and so forth and so forth. And that really kind of raised these questions around. This was kind of, mobile phones existed, but we weren't really using it part of the game because it was actually funded by the City of Melbourne. They said, we don't want to use mobiles because nobody uses those. Anyway, for this public art project. So it was very analog, which was fantastic because we had to then get permission for this fake demonstration that was presented as real from police and map the route and all of those types of things. This was, I think, maybe an example of what you were talking about, Sidney, in that it was kind of framed as a serious kind of project in that it was public art and it was we put up signage and so forth to make it look like that we had an office and that we're landscape architects, and Broadsheet wrote an article saying, there's this new landscape architecture place called Urban Codemakers and here's their website, and that was great. So we kind of pulled off this fiction, done all the ARG things, and then invited people to, the central mechanic was collecting objects off the street. And the best player experiences that we had were when players just for fun were just, what's this thing? And they'd discover the game and then they'd go down, if we're going to use ARG terminology, which maybe overlaps with Megagames, maybe not, down the rabbit hole and to discover this alternate world which then frames the city in a different way. I think that we've talked a lot about that slippage between what is serious and what is play, because if you tell someone to oh, play now, we're going to be playing a game and you're going to learn something, that's actually the worst thing you can do. You start playing and then, the learning emerges, if that's the goal or if that's what someone even gets out of it. What came out of this project was an article that I wrote about, urban play as a survival strategy, which was in fibre culture, around, the emergent, feelings that I think have become now more common through things like Megagames, such as feeling like you're part of a collective, feeling like, and this was of course referencing some of the early ARG experiences like the Cloud Makers and so forth, where collective puzzle solving just creates a set of feel good between people, and so framing it as a if we're going to talk about dystopian futures, then which we are, because we're faced with the climate crisis all the time, what will get you through that, that kind of collective play is going to be just as good, if not better, than just having a shipping container full of canned food or something like that. And the reason I paint this going towards this darker picture is that we're talking about playing games, which is fun, but also the context of just when we're living this particular decade, and the point of reference is a CIA video that was shared a couple of years ago around megacities, and they're talking about this counter-insurgency plans for megacities. We're saying, so a megacity, and there's a point to this that I'll get to in a moment. It's framing the next question. A megacity is a city with 10 million or more people. And they're saying that even if 1% of the people in that city rise up, it's still like a force of some, I think 100,000, my math's not that good, but they were concerned. So they made a whole video about it, about, how are we going to deal with, public unrest in megacities? And they used all these gaming metaphors, or these old, they saw the city as a game. So I mean, to your point around, military training, it's kind of, it's certainly kind of in there, and the history with wargaming. Not suggesting that we will become military experts, but there is something about this idea of players' resistance and collective resistance. So, long introduction to a question. In 2050, Melbourne will have almost 9 million people, so it's going to be close to what's classified as a megacity. If we were to make this Melbourne mega game about Melbourne 2050, how can we make it both, fun to play, so that people don't go away completely despondent, but also, maybe kind of play into this idea of speculative fiction or speculative design. So maybe allow people a space, even for a day, to kind of imagine what that world might be, but how they might, what they're doing now, shape that future, even in a small way.
Well, okay. I think where I'd start, and maybe a little bit as a response to some of the threads before, is that wargaming is one lineage that Megagames draw from, and it's not the only one. And role-playing has a long history. Outside of that, it's ancient storytelling and happening story. And there's a modern discipline, experiential futures, which is a subset of futures of foresight, where you're trying to expose people to alternative concepts of what the future could be, because people tend to have one way that they think the future is likely to be, or there's lots of work on deep narratives or causal layered analysis, iceberg metaphor of all these narratives and worldviews and deep beliefs that we hold that inform, constrain what we think is possible. And so experiential futures where you can immerse yourself in an alternate world is a great way to start to help people, give them the opportunity to construct new possibilities or expand the scope of what they think might be possible. And there are lots of techniques in that space. There's experiential futurists I know that are really big on creating artifacts. So they have a game where they get people to think about, okay, get into this mindset of this future and create something that exists there, one thing, and going through that. And so I think an opportunity with the 2050 Mega Game, whatever we sort of populate that future version of Melbourne with, it's about that, creating the fiction and the alternate world and bringing people into a space where we use the techniques of the games to create that immersion, that they go through this sort of emotional experience where they've identified with being a different person, a different world, and they come out, with the mind expanded, basically.
I'd actually like to ask a question of the group to delve a little bit deeper into that. And I'm going to address this with reference to Amble Studio, but not specifically address the question to you, Hailey, because that's sort of just the reference point that popped into my head. But a lot of this, it seems like some of the things that Amble Studio is doing with workplace workshops and things is sort of almost, and this is going to sound really derogatory, but I promise it's not intended that way, the toy problem version of this, where you have a group of people who are in a situation which is, and that's always sort of struck me about the Amble games, is that workplace workshop situation is so antithetical to the idea of play.
Yes.
And you have to overcome a lot of barriers in getting people to be emergent and to be spontaneous. And a lot of the games that Amble creates also sort of gets people to get quite into the emotional side of things as well. So coming with it from that reference, I'm sort of seeing a diversion into getting people to switch their frames of reference and change the system that they're understanding this interaction from, or this perspective they're understanding the interaction from a practical perspective, a workplace perspective, to a gaming perspective, a learning perspective, whatever perspective it happens to be. I wonder if I could open that one up to the panel for some comment.
I have a thought here. And no, I'm going to tag you in on this one for sure. So, talking about perspective, I think one of the things that comes across really clearly in Megagames is that they are not so much a scale outwards, but a telescoping. It is not one game, but 1,000 games. And that if we're looking at Melbourne 2050 as a mega game, the framing is not Melbourne, it's which 6 of these perspectives do we want to focus on? Because I really want to hear more from you in your experience here about the way that mega games are kind of made up of a bunch of people playing their own different sub-games that then feed into something bigger? Yeah,
so we label those game spheres. And that would be like a group of mechanics and dynamics. So I'm going to skip back to a game that we ran last year, which was also sci-fi. It's called The Ark. It was written by one of our community members, a local designer. Players were on a ship in space. The premise of the game was that the world had ended, aliens had arrived with a ship and said, get on it or die. And so this subset of humanity got on this ship and had to survive. It's very Stargate inspired. And the spheres in that game were this political aspect where you had to govern the ship. There was a farming aspect where you had to produce food. If food didn't get produced, people would starve. There was this kind of community management aspect where it was called the quarters and the cantina, where you had to go and you had to manage these problems that emerged. And as things happened in the farm and in the council and the political space, problems began to emerge in these other spheres of the game. So they're all interrelated, and all of the mechanics across those spheres are pretty standard, but people can play very much their own game within that. So I think you're absolutely right. In thinking about Melbourne as a mega game, my first question would be, well, what aspects of Melbourne are we looking at? And really, I have 2 questions, and maybe this says more about me and my relationship to Melbourne is, so what do our trains look like, and where are our Indigenous people, and what are they doing?
Yeah, 2 great questions. I think when you're talking about spheres, you can also maybe translate that to factions as well. Because, so this is something that explored in Urban Codemakers was in the Urban Codemakers collective, this fictional group of landscape architects who are working with game designers to reshape the city, there was a cross-media ecologist, a locative urbanist, and a media ecologist, and they all had different perspectives or philosophies on what the city should be, and kind of place-making strategies. Like one is, let's work with the city as it is. Another one was like, let's make it a smart city. Another one is, no, let's preserve what we have. We have to, maintain the hodl grid and law and order and these types of things. So that comes back to those questions that you have. I mean, a mega city, one of the key issues is infrastructure. Because if you don't have a proper public transport system, or if we still kind of work with this idea of the CBD being the absolute centre, and just kind of quality and a lot of life, just like pretty much. There's actually a statistic. There's a lab at RMIT that's mapped this. You can see it just drops off out by the time you get to the edge of Melbourne. It's literally like an incline going all the way down. And then a lot of people talk about the donut city. Melbourne was once a donut city where the CBD was actually empty. It was like a place you went to work. It wasn't a place it was a destination. And I think post-COVID, it is breaking up into this more distributed way, which is potentially a positive thing. But you have to connect all of that together and get rid of all the cars for one thing. So if we've got a proper rail system, that's there. Earlier today, we heard from Nawi Carolyn Briggs about her experiences in urban space. And in fact, she told this personal story around actually feeling trapped by the grid when she was looking for her grandson who was unwell, and so it was literally just bumping up against the space constantly, and eventually there was a happy ending. She found him, and all good. But yeah, the fact that for First Peoples, not only is there this history of essentially they've been through an apocalypse, a cultural apocalypse. This sense of displacement or relived experience of displacement, and everything's named something else, and the whole city's, the whole river's been re-diverted to, as Nawi pointed out earlier today, it was once a chain of ponds, so that the entire structure has been reshaped for commercial purposes. So, if we were to kind of look at this, quickly to storyboard the game design, maybe one of the factions or the spheres is what would a 2050 Melbourne look like if it was led by First Nations people, in terms of, and Hailey, we were talking about earlier today how everyone's scrambling for answers on the climate crisis, and here we have, all of this lived experience of how to live in a connected way with the world, both from a point of view of quality of life, but also a sustainable way. So, that's a really interesting conversation to bring to a mega game.
This is where I spring on you that's what my master's was about.
Right.
Climate change and sustainability in First Nations, and the Gudijumara who are in Western Victoria, and Butcher Bin, which is a World Heritage Site, and about how sustainable those land practices are and how to approach that from a Western perspective, because I'm not Indigenous. Just to throw that out there.
Can I read it?
Sure.
Would it help to talk about the specific example?
Sure, go ahead.
I just want to hit on something before we go into the example, because we're going to talk about this, and I want to get our language right before we start talking about it. When you're talking about spheres and factions being the same thing, I think that it's really critical that spheres and factions aren't the same thing. What makes a mega game interesting, where you get emergence, where like Game Design 101 on stuff like this, is that it's about different levels of agency and different levels of information and different levels of need. And so where you have a political structure who feel the need to feed the people aboard the ark, they don't have any agency to make food. That agency exists somewhere else. So they have to then go to that faction and engage with them. the way that they're engaging, that is a sphere, that is an interpersonal political sphere. There are two factions involved in that. And so factions and spheres exist at cross purposes, and it is because they exist at cross purposes that we get tension, and tension is what makes games fun.
Excellent explanation. I feel like we should make a diagram as well.
Yeah, I wish I had a texter. I would have a Venn diagram everywhere.
So I thought about sharing this in the context of thinking about 2050 and what's in it. So the project that Sidney and I are working on is climate adaptation in Marybeck Council. We were looking at this, we want to take them into a future, we think, or a very near future. And we had this decision to make around, there are all of these possible timelines / spaces / possibility spaces in terms of the IPCC climate science. There's this sort of green line where things are mostly good and we did everything right, yay, but geez, that seems like that's really out of reach now, actually. No one really thinks that's possible anymore. There's a red line where everything collapses. Where is it useful for us to be on that map if we're trying to give people an experience of thinking about, I haven't said, so the experience that we're hoping to create, and this again goes back to intention versus emergence, but the theory of change that we've been working on is that there's a cohort of people that are called the persuadables. This is a term of art that they already use in the council, where they believe something's happening and they want to do something about climate change, but maybe it feels like all they can do is vote every few years, or maybe march. But actually what would be really useful is a bunch of small preparatory changes that could happen in the local community, in addition to trying to mitigate and change things at a policy level. And so what we've proposed to do is look at the climate science for the globe, and we've decided to go just a few years out because it seems like the crisis is already here. And if you get out to 2050, it actually gets really hard. You're really getting into science fiction, and you're really making some big decisions. But a few years out, things are roughly the same. And going through, and then the first workshop that we did that Sidney mentioned was to engage people from council and other folks from the community to localize 2027 in Marybeck, assuming this level of global politics, which in a sense are out of our control. What are the kind of events and disasters we're going to see here? What's vulnerable? And what are the kinds of responses that you might start to make? And that starts to give us the world to make the game. And that was a lot of calls that we had to make, basically to go, yeah, we want to do it close. We want to do it in like a middling scenario where things are bad, but there's still possible to do something. All these sorts of things went into then that gets us the outcome that we might want.
They were informed calls, right? Like we weren't taking guesses at, I think we looked at it and we said, well, what does a game look like in a 3-degree Australia? And the answer is it doesn't look like a lot of fun to engage with because it's quite miserable, it's quite hopeless.
It's like a zombie survival game, it's not,
Which, can we make one of those next as well?
Oh, there is one.
Okay.
There is one, and I'm so happy to talk about it, but I feel like that will get us off track.
Yeah, when I used to teach games at Swinburne University, we banned zombie games for a while. There's just so many of them. And in fact, there's lots of citywide games, zombie runs and that kind of thing, which are hugely fun. But what I was going to pick up on, though, is I was just going to ask, who's going to be playing this game? Is it for people in council? Is it going to be for the general public? Or, you haven't decided yet?
Should I?
So there are two steps to this. The first is that there is a Marybeck Council version of it where we are trying to influence people in the community who already feel a certain way about climate change and who need connections and direction in which to act. They will be the people primarily that are playing it. The intent, though, is for this to be a modular system that other councils could use, that could telescope up to a state level, that could zoom down to a house level. We're really trying to create a methodology as much as we're trying to create a single game.
Yeah, if you think of the way that Dungeons & Dragons is a rule book and a bunch of guidelines, and then you can kind of transpose that in a bunch of different settings, we're looking to do something similar.
Yeah, so in 2027 we might walk into, I don't know, somewhere like JB Hi-Fi or whatever, and instead of it being the Stranger Things game, it's the,
the Merry-Beck game. Right?
Yeah.
Or this larger system that you can adapt for your local council. So that's quite a big dream.
Yeah.
You get there by making one.
But can I throw another provocative kind of comment in about this, the few when that blurry line of the game that is being played, as a result of the fun that emerges from those tensions that are kind of speculative, kind of the potential real game of of having the solutions to that. I agree that the climate is we're in a crisis, but I'm wondering whether or not the very highly intelligent kind of class of people that have benefited greatly out of destroying the environment could also in advance map out a game to actually have us continue to be subordinate to their benefit.
I'd suggest they're currently doing that.
Yeah, well, that's. But I'm wondering to what extent, this larger game, it's just pretend, the Monopoly game sort of thing of, okay, we thought we had the power of the money that we had in our pockets, but then there's a central bank digital currency emerges as a carbon efficient kind of cryptocurrency that means that other cryptocurrencies are made illegal or kind of diminished, so that the central banks return their kind of their central dominance, but can also curiously switch off the capacity to even use that currency in various ways, so that the same kind of lockdown experience that we had from Corona could be applied to theoretically saving the environment, so that as in you can't go outside your 5 kilometre zone because your money doesn't even work outside. I shouldn't call it money, I should call it your carbon ration does not work outside that zone. But it's funny that was that jumbo jet on the way over to, oh no, it's okay, that's full of people that are making a hell of a lot of money out of continuing to destroy the climate. But it's they're minions and they're kind of the people that are playing this game. I mean, I'm just trying to create a bit of tension.
Yeah, I might reframe this slightly because one of the questions I was going to ask was around whether Megagames always, and I guess you partially answered this with your example of the Merry-Beck game in a fantasy or science fiction setting, and I guess you could say 2050 is definitely science fiction. But yeah, how close to reality you can get, and it's still something that people want to play in a way.
That's an interesting question, because I think the other aspect of kind of the wargaming tradition that I haven't touched on is the historical games. So there's this whole other kind of genre of mega games where people will kind of do historical reenactments. I personally find those very boring, despite having been a history major, so I don't run them.
I love them.
And then there's LARPs as well. I mean, is this the same thing as a LARP or no?
No. I don't have much to do with LARP, so I can't quite articulate the difference, but it's, I think, a lot more involved in kind of the costuming, and it's a different kind of immersive experience.
Yeah, there's also a top end. If we go back to the history of wargaming, there's a thing called Kriegspiel, which is a Prussian gaming system that was designed to help generals understand how a battle will play out.
This is the foundation of board gaming, isn't it?
This is the foundation of, this goes right back to the start, though, as Hailey's pointed out, it's not a single lineage, and we really need to kind of stop talking about it like it is, because it is giving a lot of primacy to Kriegspiel at the cost of a lot of the lived experience. But what I will say to it is that there is an entire group of people in these Kriegspiel societies that will play out the Gettysburg wars, and there's a lot of American Civil War stuff. There is a lot of Napoleonic, where they'll play out as close to reality as they can, and I really love it from an academic perspective. I would say, and my apologies to any of them who are listening, that it is some of the most dry and disinteresting gaming that I've seen. And they do not, they love emergence within a very thin sliver of what they understand emergence to be. I would much prefer to, get aboard Den of Wolves and go do some Battlestar Galactica backstabbing personally.
Yeah, and I think even if you look to the last 10, 20 years of board game design, there are so many other possibilities around, how you can frame play, and factions and all those types of things.
For people who want to learn about this on the way out, counterinsurgency games are most often based around the Middle East and are a great place to look at factional board gaming and wargaming.
I might quickly, because we're almost out of time, and I know that Ben has this particular question, so I'm going to ask if Ben can give this. Oh, thanks, Ben. So the question really is, Ben really wants to make a mega game. We almost just did it ourselves last year for fun, then we realised how much work it was. What do we need to make a mega game? Could we make one with all of the people in this room right now? Well, we don't have time to make it right now, but do we have the skills? What's missing if we wanted to make our own mega game about Melbourne in 2050 and run it 1 year from now?
Hey, so you should come to my PAX panel, which is about making a mega game, where we intend to get audience suggestions and then build a mega game on stage in response to that. We could absolutely do that in this room. We have just started this year running mega game design workshops, which kind of I felt around in the dark and then constructed that from my reading and from having played as many games as I have. Generally, if you want to make a mega game about Melbourne, you've already got so much to draw on that really all you kind of need to think about. You've got your setting, you've got kind of, I guess you would have to figure out what genre you wanted to play in, what your game spheres were, what your agent structures were. So what are the players doing? What are the options available to them? Why do they want to do those things? And I think looking at Melbourne, there's so much.
Yeah, overthrowing capitalism and building a new collective future.
So easy, let's do it. And then it's a case of writing a rule book and off you go. And playtesting, which for us tends to be getting a couple of people in a room and working through the rules and trying to play out different scenarios, and then we just throw it to our community and run a game and see what happens. And
yeah, I think if you could probably get it happening now if we had the space for another hour. If we just made some really big calls, if it's just this, and this, and then started just pushing people, and you're in that faction, and just throw a really simple mechanic in the middle, and we'd be playstorming, which is sort of incomplete.
Yeah.
Very informal playtesting. You don't have to have a whole game design to get started playtesting. You can just do a little shard of it.
For sure.
Yeah.
But it is a series of authorial calls, and that's something that I found in trying to teach people how to do game design, is it's like when you film your documentary, you have to choose where you point the camera. And it's the same in games. You cannot put people in a room and say, my game is fully emergent, I will make no decisions. You will have to make decisions. You will have to point that camera somewhere.
Okay, but now I really want to do that.
I've seen versions of that, and something happens.
Do I have another long-winded kind of? No, I don't. Basically, just speaking of collectivity. I mean, I do actually, drop into Trades Hall Bookshop, the second-hand bookshop, which is a very interesting way of looking at an archaeology of a lot of thinkers that have actually been using words in the, the kind of maybe Wittgensteinian kind of like language game kind of thing that we're all been engaged in with for a long time. And I found this on the way down here. Barbara Ward's Spaceship Earth, as the old nationalisms recede. One of the most brilliant political commentators of our time examines what new planetary loyalties may help us achieve this world unity in the space age. But it's kind of...
Well, Spaceship Earth, I'm familiar with that term from Buckminster Fuller.
Well, exactly, yeah.
Who created one of the original mega games,
that's
the
right.
World game.
But it's interesting that there's a bigger player that's playing both Barbara and also Buckminster Fuller, and it's just in the side here, it's kind of, it includes the United Nations and the International Monetary Fund. But hopefully they've got, the good intentions for it to be a happy game that everyone actually benefits from.
If we want to start expanding the lineage of mega games, there's so many examples. There's De Boer's Game of War as well, which is a kind of really experimental war game about communications and so forth. And of course, Buckminster Fuller. Constant, another situation is to build a whole lot of models around the city. There's so many things that we could draw upon. That will bring to this workshop.
I'll make a quick response though to Ceri's earlier whole thread, which is just that scenario planning and wargaming. It came out of the military. Scenario planning was invented at Royal Dutch Shell for oil exploration, and they've had these tools for so long. and they've mastered them. And I think what I'm passionate about, or what I think I'm trying to do, and I might be easily deceived, putting on the One Ring and becoming a slave of Sauron, but is to actually go, how do you take these capabilities which are so resource intensive and so expertise intensive and actually make them, available to people? And that was the sort of D&D epiphany, was this system spread through books and through culture horizontally before the internet even existed. And I think that a similar transition of, gameful scenario planning out into a more decentralized community-based planning can happen, through the channel and through the medium of story games. So that's
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think that to my one quick kind of comment about the 2050 is that I think that not only we've got to look with the eyes that are seeing the material world and the eyes that see the conceptual world, but also almost the spirit. Like, was it materialize, kind of conceptualize, spiritualize? Like, as in, you have the spiritual kind of dimension, like not necessarily religious, but we've got to look at how we can overcome things on a much more kind of like not flattening the kind of the diversity and difference, but like actually find
find a common ground, find a point of connection. So we've got 1 minute left. I'm going to let's say thank you to everyone, and I think what we're really kind of maybe talking about is some public source world building tools. This kind of manual for if you're looking for another way of being in the world, here's an instruction book and you can try it out. So let's I'm gonna say, look, that I'm going to invite you to come to a workshop in the Future Play Lab next month, and everyone here is invited if you want to come help us build a mega game. And we have this ambition to make it playable in 1 year. It's good to have a deadline, I know that, otherwise it'll never happen. Please, if you're here in person or online, we'll announce the workshop date. We'll come together to build a mega game together about Melbourne in 2050 and what the city could be. Thanks everyone for being here, and thank you to our wonderful panelists for this discussion.
Thanks, Charlie. Thanks, Ben.
So we do need to leave this wonderful conversation quarter, but there is a space, a gathering space just out there, which is different to Lee's gather, but it's a physical gather. So feel free to hang out there if you want to stop for a chat. And of course, I'll remind you that we're going to head down to the Clarendon Street Arcade if you'd like to also check that our project out this evening. Thanks again for coming.